Now we're going to look at these four women that I noted. You have the wife of Uriah, who isn't even named. We know her name is Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon. We're going to look at Ruth, Rahab, and Tamar. And here's what I'd like to present about the first three: Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth, which, by the way, the word Tamar means palm tree, just for a little extra. But every single one of these first three women come from a nation that fought against Israel and were considered to be enemies of God. You have Tamar, this Canaanite widow/prostitute, or who presents herself as a prostitute. You have Rahab, who ends up being a Canaanite prostitute in Jericho. And you have Ruth, this faithful Moabite foreigner and widow. So you have the Canaanites and you have the Moabites, two of Israel's greatest enemies throughout the Old Testament. Let's look at Tamar real quick, because there's no other women listed in the genealogy, and that's intentional. Usually you trace a genealogy just through the men. The women aren't involved, and you notice that throughout the rest of his genealogy. No other women are noted, and it's intentional. The first one that's noted is Tamar. Tamar, if you remember in Genesis, is the daughter-in-law of Judah. Judah is one of the 12 sons of Israel, or Jacob. And after being widowed twice, both husbands ended up dying. Tamar ends up disguising herself as a prostitute to guarantee her place in the family line, and she ends up having children by her father-in-law, Judah. She takes some bold, risky actions that were used by God to continue that family line of Judah. God uses that. And so the application for us as we look at Tamar, this Canaanite widow/prostitute for a period of time, we learn that God's purposes can be accomplished through very unexpected and unconventional means. And very often that's what it looks like through our own lives. You look at the genealogy of Jesus. You say, why did God use a Canaanite widow who ended up presenting herself as a prostitute who slept with her father-in-law? Sounds a lot like Lot and his two daughters, who got him drunk in order to be able to sleep with him and preserve their legacy and preserve his name. So in our own lives, we should be thinking, in what ways have I seen God work through very unexpected and unconventional means? You would not expect God to work with someone like Tamar to be a part of his son's, genealogy. You would assume he's going to keep that line pure, a pure-blooded Israelite, but that's just not the case. The second woman to pay attention to is Rahab. Rahab is a Canaanite prostitute who helped the Israelite spies in Jericho during the conquest of Joshua. She hid the spies and helped them escape, and in return, she and her family were spared when Jericho ended up falling, right? So she's a Gentile prostitute that demonstrated faith in God and became part of the lineage of Jesus. Now, I've heard some, I forget what the evidence is for this, but I've heard some say that Rahab wasn't a prostitute, she was something else. Either way, her story proves that faith is what matters most. Not her reputation, not her heritage, not her ethnicity. And here's the application for us, is that God can redeem and forgive anyone, regardless of their past. God's kingdom is open to anyone who has faith, and God can use everyone along with their past. And sometimes what we think of when we look at the way God is working in our lives is that God won't involve my past. That's something to scrap and disregard as if it never happened. And yes, God completely deals with your sin to never remember it again. But everything up to even everything past the point of Jesus and coming to faith, but everything up to that point as well, God uses and works for good. He uses it in his plan for your life. The third woman is Ruth. If you remember, there's a whole book dedicated to her in the Old Testament. Ruth is a Moabite, right? She's a member of these people who are traditionally hostile towards Israel. And after the death of her Israelite husband, she ended up choosing to stay faithful to her mother-in-law, Naomi. And she follows her back to Israel, becomes an Israelite, worships the Israelite God. And Ruth's inclusion is very significant because she's considered a Gentile. She left her homeland, her family, her nation's gods to join the people of God. And Ruth has a reputation of faithfulness and loyalty, and her story is all about redemption. And here's the application for us. God is committed to blessing those who commit to him in believing faith or believing loyalty. Ruth's faith and commitment to Naomi and ultimately to God made her part of Jesus' lineage. A few generations after her is going to come David. Ruth, Obed, Jesse, and then David. So that's interesting to consider how God used this Moabite. You think God would not involve the Moabite nation, but we'll get there when we get there. Bathsheba is the last one. Now, Bathsheba is not a Gentile. She's an Israelite. She's the wife of King David and the mother of Solomon. And unfortunately, her relationship with David began with a scandal. David commits adultery with her. We don't necessarily get any understanding of like her choice in the matter. If the king comes knocking on your door and says, I want you, like how much say do you have in the matter? But David and her start off on with a scandal, essentially. And then her husband, Uriah, goes away to war. David has him killed. And Bathsheba later becomes the mother of Solomon. And, her connection to Jesus is very morally complex. It's a very controversial story. Of all the wives David had, why use Bathsheba? And I think here's the application for us. Like, once again, God is able to redeem and work through all of our broken situations that we disregard and want to rip out of our life story and go, that chapter has no use. That chapter can't be redeemed. God actually comes in and goes, I can redeem that. I can make good come from that. I can use that for your story and the good of those around you. And so God brings about his purposes even through human failure. Like this is not an excuse or a reason to sin, but a reason to live, free from sin, is that God can actually work through our failures. He works it all into his plan to bring about good. See, the pagan nations are part of God's story too. That's the point of this. It was never about choosing Israel to the neglect of the nations, but it was always about choosing Israel for the benefit of the nations. God is redeeming the nations by Jesus, but God has been using the nations all along to show that Israel is not, it's not all about them. This story is not all about Israel. And the last woman to note is Mother Mary. Mary, the mother of Jesus, a young Jewish woman betrothed to Joseph, conceived by the Spirit. Her inclusion in the genealogy emphasizes God's divine fulfillment of prophecy, her humble obedience in God's plan, her willingness to accept God's will even when it brought potential shame and danger, makes her a tremendous model of faith. And so the application for us is that God simply asks for our yes in obedience and trust, just a simple yes to the current decision he's placed in front of you to walk with him. And as we walk in humble obedience, God will do the impossible through us. And so all of this, the theological significance of these women, of these eras, of these two men, of Jesus being connected to all of this, it's all about God's grace and redemption. God is breaking the social norms. God is fulfilling prophecy. God is demonstrating it's always been about faith, not moral perfection, not whether or not your past can be all of that is irrelevant when it comes to the conversation of who belongs in the family of God, who gets to be a part of the legacy of Jesus. Those who have faith. Hey, if you enjoyed this clip, you're going to love the full teaching. Check out the full video by clicking right here, or check out the full series playlist right here as well. And be sure to visit abovereproachministry.com for all of our free resources. And as always, keep moving towards Jesus.